Here's a Twitter thread from one of my favorites on the platform, at Claire Shrugged, also known as Sister Outrider. I think her real name is Claire Huchin. I may have pronounced that incorrectly, I'm sorry. She writes, "All right, before we go any further, here are some thoughts about radical feminism, the gender critical movement, and differences between, because I think much of the current conflict between those two groups is caused or exasperated by conflation. Radical feminism, as we know it, has been around since the 1960s. It is a social movement recognizing that women as a sex class are oppressed by men as a sex class, that hierarchical organizing of society termed patriarchy. Radical feminism aims to end male dominance in all forms. Radical feminist priorities include ending male violence against women, the objectification and commodification of women's bodies, and the hierarchy of gender. The socialization of gender, which some term sex stereotypes, is recognized as a cornerstone of patriarchy. Radical feminists have led some of the most revolutionary critiques of traditional gender roles in modern history, something which, broadly speaking, the queer left give those pioneering generations of women altogether too little credit for. Radfems pushed back against the gendering of children's toys, clothes, and educational streaming, for example, girls being trained for the domestic sphere and boys the public, arguing that a child's potential is not determined by or limited to the gender roles society ascribes. And often, but not always, radical feminists took what we'd now term an intersectional perspective on race and class inequalities, specifically how they overlap in women's lives to create a subjugation that cannot be neatly untangled into gendered or racialized oppression. Radical feminism reached its zenith in the heyday of the women's liberation movement between the 1970s and 80s, though those politics and the women endorsing them survived the neoliberal pushback and rampant individualism of the third wave, and are now enjoying a resurgence. My feminism has always tended towards radical. From the age of 13 or so, I knew pornography, prostitution, and the sexual objectification of women were all part of our oppression. In spite of the aggressive messaging that the commodification of our bodies by and for men empowered. But, and this is a big but, I didn't properly develop radical feminist consciousness until connecting with and participating in radical feminist community. Living in a small town in Scotland, Twitter was my first real in, a way of connecting with women beyond my immediate geography. Whatever else its flaws may be, and they are legion, Twitter is a powerful tool for connecting counterpublics of women, enabling us to refine our politics, grow in understanding, raise awareness of women's oppression, and, most importantly, mobilize in collective action. As the issues of sex, gender, and self-ID grew mainstream, more and more women developed political consciousness as they realized how claims that gender, sexist stereotype, is innate, how the undermining of women's hard-won single-sex spaces and services affected their rights. In my opinion, it is a wonderful thing that broad groups of women became politicized and now work to defend our rights, but not all of them gravitated towards radical feminism. Some hold the gender-critical movement as their primary allegiance. There is overlap and difference. Radical feminism is a multifaceted politic. Dismantling the gender hierarchy is a core objective, but opposing self-ID and advocating women's spaces, that's just one strand of radfem politics. Important, yes, but always part of a wider struggle for women's liberation. As the late, great Audre Lorde said, "There is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives." Yet swathes of the gender-critical movement are entirely single-issue in focus. For some, this is a strength. In my radical feminist eyes, a fundamental flaw. I'm not saying any of this to have a go at gender-critical people. There are some, many even, truly marvelous women who claim the gender-critical label. Rather, to highlight why there is this recurring and ongoing tension between radical feminists and single-issue gender critics. For my own interventions around sex, gender, and sexuality, some gender-critical women claim me, and I'm fine with that. Others despise me. So be it. I'd rather strive to live a principled life than to try to please everybody, which is an impossibility. But while some gender-critical women claim me, I have never actually claimed the gender-critical label. Julie Bindel said it best. I'm not gender-critical. I'm a gender abolitionist. I want to tear the whole hierarchy, all the harms and inequalities it perpetuates, down, because I'm a radical feminist. This leads to some disappointment. I remember that fair cop list doing the rounds where I was described as useful, but with the caveat that I often wrote and organized around issues other than gender identity. For me, that's a point of pride. In their eyes, it diminished me. The gender-critical movement is predominantly single issue in focus. There is no cohesive underlying set of politics motivating all those who participate in it. Some are left-wing, some are right-wing, and, most troubling of all, some belong to the far right. Sophie Corcoran, a far-right contrarian who has variously condemned single mothers, migrants, and people of color, was platformed at Standing for Women. Hearts of Oak, the latest project of Islamophobe and white nationalist Tommy Robinson, streamed Standing for Women. The far right capitalizes on the politically nebulous nature of the gender-critical movement, using it to advance their interests in racist and classist politics as well as traditional gender roles. And as the curator of that space, Kelly J. Keene is absolutely complicit. You cannot, with a shred of integrity, claim to be standing for women while throwing women of color, working-class women, migrant and refugee women under the bus in order to capitalize on far-right populism to advance your own personal brand and sell merchandise. This is the key difference. Gender critics are in many cases prepared to ally with anyone who recognizes there are two immutable biological sexes, whereas radical feminists choose to align and collaborate with those who advance the interest of women's rights. And women claim it's worth allying with anyone who recognizes that there are two immutable sexes, including the religious right, for example, Hands Across the Aisle or the Heritage Foundation. It's like witnessing a chicken decide to team up with Colonel Sanders. The far right, the religious right, have a fundamentally regressive agenda. They invest time, money, and political power into undermining women's rights, employment rights, divorce rights, reproductive rights, parental rights, you name it, they are coming for it. Furthermore, unlike radical feminism, gender criticism is not necessarily rooted in women-centered politics, which is why men across the political spectrum, from liberals like Graham Linehan to far-right traditionalists like Matt Walsh, are actively centered in gender-critical discourse. Radical feminism is woman-centric by default. It's why, for example, we care about survivors of sex trafficking, which disproportionately targets women who are poor, of color, and from the global south. Women who are actively marginalized and harmed by far-right, gender-critical allies. I understand that saying all this will likely make me unpopular, that it will lead to shunning and quite possibly outright abuse. But with this platform and these radical feminist politics comes a responsibility that I'm trying to live up to in speaking truth to power. Call me a head girl. Call me a troublemaker. Call me any variety of unflattering things that are code for a Black woman who does not know her place. But please think critically about the growing allegiance between the far right and the gender-critical movement.